In the spring of 2024, the suffocating, predictable silence of Pine Creek Valley was shattered. It didn't start with a storm, but with a low, heavy rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of every house on Main Street. Three matte black SUVs, the kind with armor-plated doors and windows tinted so dark they swallowed the light, rolled into the dusty heart of the town. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, flanked by two private security vehicles. Above them, the rhythmic chopping roar of a sleek corporate helicopter cut through the clouds, casting a massive shadow over the town square. This was the kind of wealth and raw power that Pine Creek had never seen. The kind of money that could buy the entire valley and still have enough left over to pave the roads in gold. Within minutes, the town was paralyzed. People spilled out of the diner, leaving their coffees half empty. Shop owners abandoned their registers. Nearly the entire population of Pine Creek gathered around the central plaza, whispering in hushed, nervous tones. CNN and local news cameras, which had arrived just an hour prior, under mysterious instructions, were already setting up their tripods, pointing their lenses toward a crumbling wooden stage in the center of the square. Standing on that stage was Cora Washington. She was 65 years old, wearing a faded floral dress she had sewn herself over a decade ago. Her shoulders were stooped from years of agonizing labor, her hands heavily calloused and scarred by thousands of needle pricks. Tears were streaming down her deeply lined face, her whole body trembling violently like a leaf caught in a hurricane. Beside the stage stood Mayor Evelyn, the town's undisputed matriarch, whose face had drained of all color, her jaw slack with a mixture of terror and absolute confusion. The lead SUV finally came to a halt, the engine cut off. The heavy door swung open and the first of three men stepped out into the crisp morning air. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, moving with the predatory confidence of a man who owned the world. Behind him emerged two others, equally imposing, equally untouchable. They were billionaires, titans of industry, the most feared and respected young tycoons on the East Coast. But as the lead man locked eyes with the frail, weeping woman on the wooden stage, his cold, hardened expression completely broke. His breathing hitched. He took a step forward, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the gasps of the crowd, and whispered a word that made the entire town of Pine Creek freeze in absolute disbelief. "Mom." 20 years ago, this very town had convinced itself that Cora Washington was a fool. They had mocked her, isolated her, and eventually, they had watched her lose everything. But what the town of Pine Creek didn't know was that the three most powerful men in the country had just returned to collect a 20-year-old debt, and they were about to bring the entire valley to its knees. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this moment and the justice that was about to be served, we have to rewind the clock. We have to leave the helicopters and the cameras behind and go back to a time before the money, before the power. We need to go back to the year 2004. Pine Creek 20 years ago was a place where everybody knew your sins, but nobody cared about your struggles. It was a picturesque, suffocating little valley town with a population of just over 3,000. It had one main grocery store, a single church, with a towering white steeple and a culture of quiet, polite exclusion. It was the kind of town where judgments were passed over white picket fences, and where the color of your skin or the thickness of your wallet determined exactly where you sat in the local hierarchy. Cora Washington lived on the very edge of town, both literally and figuratively. At 45 years old, she resided in a decaying three-room wooden house that her grandfather had built back in the 50s. The floorboards creaked in protest with every step. The front porch sagged heavily to the left, and a massive, ugly blue tarp covered the kitchen roof, barely holding back the spring rains. Cora was a seamstress, not the glamorous kind who designed wedding gowns, but the kind who hemmed worn-out trousers, patched up torn overalls, and took in dresses for the wealthy women of Pine Creek, women like Evelyn, who would soon become the town's mayor. Cora worked brutally long hours. She would sit hunched over her rusted Singer sewing machine from before the sun came up until her eyes burned in the midnight darkness. She took home maybe $900 on a good month. Her mortgage was $500. The math was a constant, terrifying knot in her stomach. Yet poverty wasn't the heaviest thing Cora carried. It was the crushing, echoing emptiness of her house. More than anything in this world, Cora had wanted to be a mother. She had spent her 20s and 30s dreaming of little footsteps running across her porch, of packing school lunches, of reading bedtime stories. But life had been cruel, after a devastating illness in her late 30s left her unable to have children, and the subsequent abandonment by a man who couldn't handle the grief. Cora had packed her maternal instincts away in a dark, quiet corner of her heart. Instead, she poured all of her love into the neighborhood strays, her flourishing backyard vegetable garden, and the intricate garments she sewed for children she would never have. Every Sunday, she sat in the back row of the town church, watching families gather, feeling a hollow ache in her chest. The townspeople were cordial to her face, offering tight-lipped smiles, but behind her back, she was just poor Cora, the lonely, aging black woman at the edge of the woods who didn't quite fit into their perfect, polished community. Every night before she crawled into her freezing bed, Cora would look up at a small, hand-carved wooden sign hanging above her brick fireplace. It was a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother. The painted letters were chipping, but the words remained clear. A house only becomes a home when it is brave enough to hold someone else's pain. She had stared at that sign thousands of times. She had no idea that she was about to find out exactly how much pain her fragile little house could hold. It happened on a rainy Tuesday night in late October. The wind was howling, rattling the thin glass of Cora's windows, threatening to tear the blue tarp right off the roof. Cora was in the kitchen, exhausted, wrapping her freezing hands around a mug of cheap tea when the rotary phone on the wall suddenly screamed to life. It was 11:30 p.m. Nobody ever called Cora at this hour. Nobody ever called her at all. She picked up the heavy receiver, her heart skipping a beat. "Hello, Cora, it's Brenda." The voice on the other end was breathless, frayed with panic. Brenda was a social worker for the state, an old acquaintance Cora knew from her younger days volunteering at the county center. "Brenda, is everything all right? You sound out of breath." "Cora, I know it's late. I know this is entirely out of line, and I have no right to ask you this." Brenda stammered, the desperation bleeding through the static of the line. "But I am completely out of options. I'm staring at a total tragedy here, and you are the only person left on my list." Cora stood up straighter, the fatigue instantly evaporating from her bones. "Slow down. Tell me what's happening." Brenda took a ragged breath. "I have 3 boys in my office right now. Brothers. They've been bouncing through the foster care system for 2 years. Cora, nobody wants them. I mean, absolutely nobody. I've called 12 different homes tonight. Every single family in the county has rejected them." "Why?" Cora asked, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong with them?" "They're difficult," Brenda said, choosing her words carefully. "They're deeply traumatized. The last foster home sent them back tonight because of an incident. The oldest is 14, but he has the eyes of a war veteran. The middle one is 11 and solves all his problems with his fists. And the youngest, Joe, he's 8 years old, Cora, and he hasn't spoken a single word in 6 months." A heavy silence fell over the line, save for the sound of the rain lashing against Cora's window panes. "If I can't find them a placement by midnight," Brenda's voice finally cracked, "the state mandate kicks in. I have to separate them. They'll be sent to 3 different juvenile group homes across 3 different counties. They've already lost their parents. If I do this, they're going to lose each other forever. It will destroy them." Cora looked around her dim, drafty kitchen. She looked at the 3 plastic buckets on the floor, slowly catching the murky water dripping from the ceiling. She thought about her bank account, which currently held exactly $142. She had barely enough food in the pantry to feed herself through the weekend, let alone 3 growing, troubled boys. Logically, financially, and practically, it was an impossible request. She was a single, impoverished woman in a town that would inevitably judge her for bringing 3 strange, troubled children into their pristine neighborhood. Cora closed her eyes. She thought of a 14-year-old boy carrying the weight of the world, an 11-year-old fighting a phantom enemy, an 8-year-old who had decided that the world was so dark it wasn't even worth speaking to anymore. She opened her eyes and looked at the wooden sign above her fireplace. A house only becomes a home when it is brave enough to hold someone else's pain. "Brenda," Cora said, her voice dropping an octave, steady and absolute. "Yes, Cora. Don't you dare separate those boys." Cora reached for her worn-out coat hanging by the door. "Bring them to me. Bring them home." The rain was coming down in thick and heavy sheets when the rusted state-county van finally pulled into the dirt driveway. It was well past 1 in the morning. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the deep puddles and the overgrown weeds in the front yard. Cora stood on her sagging porch, wrapping a thin woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders to ward off the biting autumn cold. She watched as Brenda stepped out of the driver's seat, holding a flimsy plastic umbrella that threatened to turn inside out with every gust of wind. Brenda slid open the heavy side door of the van. For a long moment, nothing happened. The darkness inside the vehicle seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, the first boy stepped out into the freezing rain. This was Leo. He was 14 years old, but he carried the heavy and rigid posture of an exhausted soldier returning from a long war. His clothes were damp and smelled faintly of mildew. His jaw was set like stone, and his dark eyes scanned the dilapidated house, the dark woods, and finally, Cora herself. He was looking for threats. He had learned the hard way that every new house was just a new battlefield. Behind him emerged Julian. He was 11 years old, wiry and vibrating with an intense nervous energy. He had a fading purple bruise on his left cheekbone and a fresh scrape across his knuckles. Julian did not look at Cora. His eyes darted toward the road, analyzing the distance, calculating exactly how long it would take to run away if things went bad. Finally, the youngest stepped out, hiding almost entirely behind his older brothers. His name was Sam. He was 8 years old and incredibly small for his age. His shoes had holes in the toes, and he was shivering violently in the damp air. Clutched tightly against his chest, like a protective shield, was a thick, weather-beaten leather notebook. The edges of the pages were crumpled, and the leather was stained, but Sam held it as if it contained his very soul. Brenda walked them up the wooden steps. They carried all of their worldly possessions in 3 black plastic garbage bags. Cora looked at the 3 boys standing on her porch. They were dripping wet, terrified, and ready to fight for their lives. Cora did something that none of their previous foster parents had ever done. She did not give them a look of pity. Foster children despise pity. Pity makes them feel broken. Instead, Cora knelt right there on the wet wooden boards of the porch, bringing herself down to their eye level. She looked directly at Sam, then Julian, and finally met the hard, defiant gaze of Leo. "Welcome home," she said softly. Her voice was calm and steady, cutting right through the noise of the storm. "My name is Cora. This house is old and it is not very big, but as long as you are standing under this roof, you are completely safe." Leo narrowed his eyes. He had heard this speech before. Every single foster home gave them the exact same speech on the first night, right before the screaming and the locking of doors began. "I have 3 simple rules." Cora continued, standing up and opening the front door to let the warmth of the house spill out into the cold night. "First, we always eat our meals together. Second, we do not lie to each other no matter how bad the truth is. And third, nobody in this house goes to sleep without knowing they are loved." Julian let out a harsh, sarcastic scoff. "That is a stupid rule," he muttered under his breath. Cora did not miss a beat. She looked at Julian with a gentle smile. "It is not a rule, Julian. It is a promise." Something flickered deep inside Leo's eyes just for a fraction of a second before the hardened wall came right back up. That first night, Cora guided them into the small kitchen. She heated up a large pot of beef and potato stew she had made the day before. She placed 3 steaming bowls on the wooden table along with thick slices of toasted bread. Leo and Julian ate like starving animals. They shoved the food into their mouths with desperate speed, their eyes constantly darting around the room, terrified that someone was going to snatch the bowls away from them. Sam did not eat. He sat perfectly still, staring down at the brown broth, holding his leather notebook tightly in his lap. He had not spoken a word in 6 months, not since the day their parents were taken away. Cora pulled up a chair and sat next to the youngest boy. She did not push the spoon into his hand. She did not demand that he eat. "Sam, honey," she whispered gently, "you do not have to say a single word, but you do have to eat. Just 1 bite for me." Sam slowly looked up. It was the first time he had made direct eye contact with an adult in weeks. He saw the deep, warm brown of Cora's eyes. He saw the total absence of anger. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he picked up his spoon and took a small bite. Cora felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She knew the battle had only just begun. The first 2 months were an absolute nightmare. The boys tested Cora constantly, waiting for her to snap, waiting for her to throw them out, just like everyone else had. Leo was the hardest to crack. He was the protector, and he believed that trusting an adult was a fatal mistake. He began sneaking out of the house at night. He would wander the dark, empty roads of Pine Creek, daring Cora to call the police on him. One freezing Tuesday night, Leo returned to the house well past 2 in the morning. He braced himself for the yelling. He expected to find his garbage bags packed and sitting by the front door. Instead, he found Cora sitting in the old rocking chair on the front porch. She had a thick blanket over her legs and a plate of warm food resting in her lap. She looked up at him as he trudged up the steps. "I do not know where you were," Cora said calmly, her voice devoid of any judgment. "You are going to tell me eventually, because that is one of our rules. But right now, you are going to come inside and eat, because that is one of my promises." Leo stared at her in total confusion. There were no threats. There was no screaming. There was just a tired woman holding a plate of food, refusing to give up on him. He sat down on the porch step, took the plate, and ate in the quiet dark. The next week, he was home before 10. Julian's pain manifested differently. His pain came out entirely through his fists. Within the first 6 weeks, Cora received 4 phone calls from the principal at the Pine Creek Elementary School. Julian was fighting in the hallways. He was fighting in the cafeteria. He was fighting anyone who even looked at his brothers the wrong way. Cora showed up to the school every single time. She walked past the whispering, wealthy mothers in the parking lot, holding her head high despite her worn-out clothes. She sat in the sterile office of the principal, a man who looked at her with blatant disapproval. "This behavior is completely unacceptable," the principal said sternly, sliding a suspension form across the desk. "This boy is a menace to my students." Cora placed her scarred hands flat on the desk. "I agree that fighting is wrong," she said firmly, "but I am very curious. Has anyone in this building bothered to ask this child why he is throwing punches, or do you all just skip straight to the punishment?" The principal had no answer. Cora turned to Julian, who was sitting in the corner, staring at the floor, with his fists clenched. She knelt in front of him. "Who were you hitting today, Julian?" she asked softly. Julian kept his head down. They were laughing at Sam, he mumbled fiercely. "They tried to take his notebook. I was making them stop." Cora closed her eyes. She stood up, took the suspension paper, and ripped it in half. She took Julian by the hand and walked him out of the school. That very weekend, Cora took a portion of her meager grocery money and bought an old heavy canvas punching bag from a garage sale. She hung it from the thick oak tree in the backyard. "If you need to hit something, you hit this," she told Julian, wrapping his small hands in torn strips of cotton fabric to protect his knuckles. "You are allowed to be angry. You have every right to be angry at the world, but you must control it, Julian. Do not ever let the anger control you." Julian found his salvation under that oak tree. He would hit the bag until his arms went numb, channeling all the rage and grief that had been eating him alive from the inside out. He stopped fighting at school. He started coming home physically exhausted but mentally quiet. And then there was Sam. Sam remained entirely silent. He went to school, he did his chores, and he sat at the dinner table, but no words ever crossed his lips. Cora never pushed him. Every single night she would pull a chair up next to his bed and read to him from old library books. She read about brave knights, magical lands, and endless adventures. Sam would listen intently, his eyes following her every expression, holding his leather notebook tight against his chest. It was a slow, agonizing process. The house was poor, the food was simple, and the roof still leaked into the plastic buckets whenever it rained. But slowly, the thick, icy walls around the 3 boys began to melt. They were starting to realize that the rules in this small, drafty house were different. They were beginning to realize that for the first time in a very long time, they were truly safe. But just as the fragile pieces of their broken family started to glue themselves together, the sky above Pine Creek darkened. The town was about to test the strength of this newfound bond. A brutal winter was fast approaching, and it was going to bring a cold so deep it would threaten to destroy everything Cora had built. By late January, Pine Creek Valley was swallowed by a winter so severe that the older folks claimed it was the worst storm in 30 years. The temperature dropped far below zero. The sky turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the snow fell in massive, blinding sheets. The wind tore through the valley like a freight train, ripping tree branches from their trunks and burying the roads under thick, impassable drifts of white. For the wealthy residents of Pine Creek, the storm was merely an inconvenience. They retreated into their large, well-insulated homes, turned on their gas fireplaces, and listened to the low hum of their backup generators. But for Cora Washington, living in a decaying wooden house on the edge of the woods, the storm was an absolute nightmare. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the power lines running to Cora's street finally snapped under the heavy weight of the ice. The house plunged into total darkness. The old electric heater in the hallway died with a sad clicking sound. Within an hour, the inside of the house was almost as freezing as the outside. The blue plastic tarp covering the kitchen roof froze entirely solid, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the inside of the bedroom windows. Cora moved through the dark house using only a single wax candle. She gathered every blanket, every towel, and every thick coat she owned. She brought Leo, Julian, and Sam into the small living room, making a makeshift bed on the rug. She piled the blankets on top of them, trying to trap whatever body heat they had left. But the temperature kept dropping. Around 4 in the morning, Sam started to cough. At first, it was just a small dry sound, but within 30 minutes, it turned into a deep, wet rattle that shook his entire tiny frame. Cora placed her bare hand on his forehead, and her heart nearly stopped beating. His skin was burning hot, radiating a dangerous fever, but his lips were turning a terrifying shade of blue. He was shivering so violently that his teeth were chattering together. Cora pulled him out from under the blankets and wrapped her arms tightly around him, trying to transfer her own body heat into his freezing chest. "Sam, baby, look at me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Open your eyes for me." Sam's eyelids fluttered, but they were heavy. His breathing was growing incredibly shallow. He was slipping into the early and fatal stages of hypothermia, complicated by a severe respiratory infection. Cora knew instantly that if they waited for the morning sun, Sam would not survive. She stood up. She took her thickest winter coat, a heavy woolen thing that had belonged to her grandfather, and wrapped it completely around Sam. She tied a scarf around his head, covering his ears and his nose. Leo sat up from the pile of blankets. He was shivering, his eyes wide with rising panic. "Where are you going?" Leo asked, his voice cracking. "I have to get him to the hospital," Cora said firmly. She pulled on her boots, which were already stiff with the cold. "It is 3 miles away," Leo said, standing up. "You cannot walk in this. The snow is up to your waist. You will freeze to death. Let me go. I am faster." "No," Cora said, pointing a stern finger at the 14-year-old boy. "You listen to me very carefully, Leo. You stay right here. You keep Julian warm. You huddle together, and you do not leave this room. I am taking your brother to get help, and I swear to you, I will bring him back." Cora did not wait for an argument. She picked up the 8-year-old boy. He felt like dead weight in her arms. She kicked open the front door and stepped out into the roaring blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical punch to the chest. The wind screamed in her ears, whipping ice crystals against her face that felt like thousands of tiny needles. The snow was incredibly deep, reaching past her knees with every single step she took. She held Sam tightly to her chest, putting her head down, and began to push forward through the blinding white chaos. Every step was pure agony. Her legs burned with the massive effort. Her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass every time she took a breath. Within the first half mile, she lost all feeling in her toes. Soon after, her fingers went completely numb, but she kept walking. She focused entirely on the faint, rattling sound of Sam breathing against her collarbone. She needed a car. She knew she could not make it all 3 miles on foot. A mile down the road, she saw a large 2-story brick house. Warm yellow light was spilling out from the windows onto the snow. She could hear the steady hum of a heavy-duty generator. It was the home of Evelyn, the woman who would later become the mayor of Pine Creek. Evelyn had a massive 4-wheel drive truck sitting in the driveway, perfectly capable of navigating the snowy roads. Cora dragged her freezing, exhausted body up the long paved driveway. She reached the heavy oak door and began to pound on it with her numb fists. She hit the wood again and again, leaving small smears of blood where her knuckles had cracked from the cold. Finally, the porch light clicked on. The heavy door cracked open just a few inches. Evelyn stood in the doorway wearing a thick silk robe, looking annoyed at being woken up. "Evelyn, please," Cora begged, gasping for air. Her voice was barely a whisper over the wind. "It is the little boy. He is burning up. He cannot breathe. I need you to drive us to the county clinic. Please, I am begging you." Evelyn looked at Cora. She looked at the shivering, pale white child, wrapped in the oversized coat. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She knew this was one of the troubled orphans the town had been gossiping about. "Cora, are you out of your mind?" Evelyn said, her voice dripping with cold judgment. "You dragged that sick child out into a blizzard. The roads are completely unplowed. My truck has expensive tires, but I am not risking my life and my vehicle in the middle of the night for this." "Evelyn, he is dying." Cora sobbed, tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. I will pay for the gas. I will clean your house for a month for free. Just please open the door. You should have thought about the consequences before you took in children you could not afford to take care of." Evelyn said coldly, "Go back home, Cora. Call an ambulance in the morning when the roads are clear." And with those words, Evelyn shut the heavy oak door. The deadbolt clicked into place. The porch light went dark. Cora stood alone on the icy steps, completely abandoned. A massive wave of despair washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a hot, blinding surge of maternal fury. She looked down at Sam. His eyes were closed. "Hold on, baby," Cora whispered into the howling wind. "Just hold on." She turned away from the massive brick house and walked back into the snow. She did not feel the cold anymore. She did not feel the burning in her legs. She was fueled entirely by pure adrenaline and the absolute refusal to let this child die. She walked for another hour. She fell 3 times in the deep snowdrifts, scraping her knees on the hidden asphalt below, but every single time she forced herself back up. When the bright red emergency sign of the county clinic finally cut through the darkness, Cora was stumbling. She hit the automatic sliding doors and collapsed onto the sterile tile floor of the waiting room. Nurses rushed forward. They took Sam from her frozen arms. They shouted medical terms, lifting the boy onto a gurney and rushing him through the swinging doors into the emergency ward. Cora tried to stand up to follow them, but her legs finally gave out. She sat heavily on a plastic waiting room chair, shaking violently, her clothes completely soaked through. An hour passed, then 2. The storm raged outside the hospital windows. Around 6 in the morning, the heavy emergency room doors opened. The doctor stepped out. He looked exhausted, but he offered Cora a gentle nod. "We stabilized him," the doctor said quietly. "He had severe hypothermia and the beginnings of pneumonia. If you had brought him in even 20 minutes later, his heart would have stopped. He is sleeping now. He is going to be all right." Cora buried her face in her hands and let out a long, ragged sob of pure relief. Suddenly, the sliding doors of the clinic lobby hissed open. A blast of freezing air swept into the room. Cora looked up. Standing in the doorway, covered from head to toe in thick white snow, were Leo and Julian. The 2 boys had not stayed in the house. The moment the sun began to rise, they had followed Cora's deep footprints through the snow for 3 miles, absolutely terrified that they had lost their brother and their new mother. Cora rushed over and pulled both freezing boys into her arms. She did not yell at them for leaving the house. She just held them tightly, burying her face into their icy hair. "We thought you were dead," Julian cried, his tough exterior finally shattering into a million pieces. The boy who fought everyone was sobbing openly into Cora's wet coat. "I am right here," Cora whispered, rocking them back and forth. "I am right here." Leo pulled back slightly. He looked at Cora. He saw her bloody knuckles. He saw the purple frostbite creeping up the edges of her ears. He saw the sheer exhaustion in her eyes. The 14-year-old boy who had spent his entire life believing that the world was a cruel and selfish place looked at the woman who had just walked through a blizzard to save his little brother. "Why did you do this?" Leo asked, his voice shaking with a heavy, confusing emotion. "Why did you almost die for us? We are not even yours. We are nobody." Cora looked deeply into Leo's eyes. She reached up with a numb, trembling hand and gently wiped the melting snow from his cheek. "Let me tell you something my grandmother told me," Cora said softly, her voice filling the quiet, sterile hallway of the clinic. "She said that family is not about the blood in your veins. Blood does not make a family. Family is about who is willing to walk through the ice storm when everyone else locks their doors." She pulled Leo and Julian close to her chest again. "You are mine," she whispered fiercely. "You are my boys, and I am showing up for you. That is all I know how to do." For the first time since his parents died, Leo did not pull away. He did not look for an escape route. He let his heavy head rest against Cora's shoulder, and he allowed himself to lean on someone else. The storm outside continued to rage, burying the town of Pine Creek in absolute freezing silence. But inside that small hospital waiting room, something incredibly warm had finally taken root. They were no longer 3 wild, broken animals living in a leaking house. They were a family. And they were going to need each other because the true storm had not even arrived yet. 18 months passed. The brutal winter eventually surrendered to a brilliant golden summer. The year was 2006. The small wooden house at the edge of the woods was still poor. The roof still had a blue tarp and the floorboards still creaked, but the heavy, suffocating silence that once filled the rooms was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the chaotic and wonderful sounds of a real family. The transformation in the three boys was nothing short of a miracle. Leo was now almost 16 years old. He no longer paced the floors at night, looking for escape routes. His shoulders had dropped, and the hardened look in his eyes had softened into something resembling hope. He had taken a part-time job at the local hardware store to help Cora pay for groceries. Every evening, he sat at the kitchen table studying for his high school classes, talking about going to college to become a social worker. And he no longer called her Cora. He called her Mom. Julian was 13. He had grown taller and stronger. He no longer fought with the kids at school. Following Cora's advice, he channeled his endless energy into physical labor and discipline. He chopped all the firewood for the house. He joined the youth boxing program at the county community center. He learned how to take a hit, how to breathe, and how to control the fire inside his chest. He came home with bruised ribs and a tired smile, proudly hanging his local boxing tournament medals on the old refrigerator. And Sam. Sam was 10 years old and he was no longer silent. His first words had come on a quiet Sunday morning, asking Cora to pass the milk. Now he never stopped talking. He read out loud from his leather notebook every single night on the front porch. He wrote stories about brave knights slaying ice dragons, stories that sounded remarkably like a brave woman walking through a deadly blizzard to save a little boy. Life inside the house was beautiful, but outside the house, the town of Pine Creek was growing increasingly hostile. The townspeople could not understand how a poor single woman was managing to raise 3 troubled boys so well. Instead of offering praise, they offered deep suspicion. Mayor Evelyn was the loudest voice among them. She still remembered the night Cora pounded on her door in the freezing rain, and Evelyn felt a deep secret shame about refusing to help. To cover up her guilt, she went on the offensive. Evelyn stood in the aisles of the local grocery store whispering toxic rumors to anyone who would listen. She told the town that Cora was only keeping the boys to collect the monthly foster care checks from the state. She claimed the boys were dangerous and a threat to the neighborhood. When Cora walked down Main Street to buy flour or rice, conversations would suddenly stop. The wealthy women would grab their purses a little tighter. They stared at her with cold, judging eyes. Cora heard every single whisper. She felt the heavy weight of their harsh stares, but she kept her head held incredibly high. She knew the truth. She knew the pure love that existed inside her home, and she refused to let the bitterness of Pine Creek poison her family. She focused entirely on her sowing her garden and her 3 growing boys. But the fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered by something much worse than local gossip. It started in late August. The summer heat was thick and oppressive. Cora was hanging laundry on the clothesline in the backyard when she noticed a vehicle parked at the far end of the dirt road. It was a sleek, black luxury sedan. It was parked under the shade of a large oak tree sitting perfectly still. Cora thought it was just a lost driver. Pine Creek was confusing to navigate, but the car did not move. It sat there for 3 hours before quietly rolling away. The next afternoon, the black car returned. It parked in the exact same spot. The engine was turned off, but the windows were tinted so dark that Cora could not see who was inside. It sat there watching the house until the sun finally went down. On the 3rd day, Leo noticed it. He was carrying a basket of fresh tomatoes from the garden when he stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the black car down the road. His face went completely pale and the basket of tomatoes slipped from his hands, falling heavily onto the grass. "What is wrong?" baby Cora asked, rushing over to him. Leo could not take his eyes off the vehicle. "They found us," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw terror Cora had not seen in 18 months. "We have to pack. We have to run right now." Before Cora could ask him what he meant, Friday arrived, and the cruel waiting game finally ended. It was a humid Friday afternoon. Cora was sitting on the front porch with Sam, listening to him read a new story. Suddenly, the deep, powerful rumble of a massive engine filled the air. It was not the sleek sedan from the previous days. It was a long, custom-built black limousine. It turned off the main road and drove straight toward Cora's house. The limousine did not stop at the edge of the property. It drove right up the dirt driveway, its heavy tires crushing Cora's blooming flower beds without a single ounce of hesitation. It came to a halt just a few feet from the wooden porch steps. The heavy back door swung open. A man stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. He was in his late 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and a sharp, aristocratic face. He wore a dark, custom-tailored suit that cost more than Cora's entire house. He carried a silver-tipped walking cane, but he did not lean on it. He held it like a dangerous weapon. He radiated absolute coldness and absolute authority. This was a man who spent his life giving orders and completely destroying anyone who dared to say no. Behind him emerged a younger man in a gray suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked like a high-priced corporate lawyer. The older man stood in the driveway and looked at the decaying wooden house. His upper lip curled in deep disgust as he took in the sagging roof, the peeling paint, and the rusted sewing machine visible through the front window. Then his cold, piercing eyes locked onto Cora. "Are you Cora Washington?" the man asked. His voice was smooth but incredibly sharp, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Yes, I am," Cora said. She stood up slowly, putting herself between the strange man and 10-year-old Sam. "May I help you?" The man did not offer his hand. He did not introduce himself politely. He simply stared at her as if she were dirt on the bottom of his expensive shoes. "My name is Victor Sterling," he said flatly, "and I have come to collect my property." Cora frowned, her heart beginning to beat faster. "I am sorry, Mr. Sterling, but I am a seamstress. You do not have any property here." Victor Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh. He pointed his silver cane directly at the front door of the house. "I am not talking about clothes, Miss Washington. I am talking about my blood. I am here for Leo Julian and Sam. They are my daughter's children. I am their biological grandfather, and I am taking them home right now." The air vanished from Cora's lungs. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. She gripped the wooden railing of the porch to keep herself from falling over. "Your grandchildren!" Cora gasped, shaking her head. "No, that is impossible. The state looked for relatives for 2 years. They told me the boys had absolutely nobody left." Before Victor could answer, the screen door creaked open. Leo walked out onto the porch. He was holding a heavy wooden baseball bat by his side. His knuckles were white. His jaw was clenched so tight, it looked like his teeth might shatter. Julian pushed past him, freezing exactly where he stood. The boy who loved to fight was suddenly paralyzed by absolute fear. Sam hid entirely behind Cora's skirt, clutching his notebook. "You," Leo whispered. The word carried so much hatred and so much pain that it made Cora shiver, despite the summer heat. "Hello, Leo," Victor said calmly, completely ignoring the baseball bat. "You look exactly like your foolish father. Put that piece of wood down and go tell your brothers to pack their garbage bags. We are leaving." "You left us to rot," Leo shouted, stepping in front of Cora. "You hated my dad. You cut my mom off when she married him. When they died in that car crash, the social workers called you. They sent you letters. And you told them you did not care what happened to us. You threw us into the system. You let us starve." Victor Sterling's face remained completely emotionless. "I made a calculated decision to let you experience the real world," he said coldly. "I wanted the weakness burned out of you. And looking at you now, it seems the foster system did exactly what I wanted. It made you tough. Now that you are old enough to be molded, I am taking you back to the Sterling estate to prepare you for the family business." "We are not going anywhere with you," Leo spat, raising the bat slightly. "This is our home. This is our mother." Victor let out a heavy sigh, looking extremely bored. He nodded to the lawyer standing beside him. The lawyer stepped forward, opening the leather briefcase. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents, stamped with official state seals. "Miss Washington," the lawyer said smoothly, "my client is one of the wealthiest men on the eastern seaboard. He is the only living blood relative of these 3 minors. We have already spoken to a federal judge this morning. We have an emergency custody transfer order signed and executed. You are merely a temporary foster placement. You have 0 legal rights. If you try to stop us from putting these boys in that car, I will have the county sheriff arrest you for kidnapping." Cora looked at the thick stack of papers. She looked at the cold, arrogant face of the billionaire. She realized she was completely outmatched. She had no money for high-priced lawyers and no power in the eyes of the state. She was just a poor seamstress. But as she looked at Leo, whose tough exterior was finally breaking down into raw terror, she knew she could not give up without a fight. The brilliant summer had vanished in an instant. The darkest storm was finally here, and it had come dressed in a bespoke suit, wielding the full and crushing power of the law. Cora Washington did not step aside. She stood on the wooden porch of her decaying house, placing her frail body entirely between the billionaire and the three terrified boys. She looked at the expensive lawyer with his thick stack of papers. She looked at the cold, calculating eyes of Victor Sterling. "I do not care how much money you have," Cora said, her voice shaking but completely resolute. "I do not care if you own half the country. You abandoned these children to the streets. You cannot just show up after 2 years and throw them into the back of a car like they are pieces of luggage. I demand a proper hearing in front of a family court judge." The wealthy lawyer opened his mouth to threaten her with the sheriff, but Victor Sterling raised a single well-manicured hand to silence him. Victor looked at Cora with a mixture of amusement and deep pity. "Very well, Miss Washington," Victor said smoothly. "I enjoy doing things by the book. It makes the victory much more permanent. You have exactly 3 weeks until the hearing. Spend that time saying your goodbyes, because when we step into that courtroom, I am going to crush you." The limousine backed down the dirt driveway and disappeared down the road. The next 21 days were an absolute nightmare. Cora knew she was walking into a battle she could not possibly win, but she refused to surrender. She took on extra sewing jobs, working until 3 in the morning every single night. She sold her beautiful backyard vegetable garden to a local market. She even pawned the antique gold locket her grandmother had left her. She scraped together every single penny she could find and hired the only lawyer in the county who would take her case. He was a young man fresh out of law school, charging $80 an hour. He was going up against a legal team from the city that charged more per minute than Cora made in an entire year. The day of the hearing arrived. The county courthouse was a grand building made of heavy white stone. Inside the courtroom, the contrast was sickening. On one side of the aisle sat Cora wearing her best patched dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her sat Leo, Julian, and Sam. They were holding hands, terrified of the men across the room. On the other side sat Victor Sterling. He was flanked by 6 high-priced attorneys in matching dark suits. They had briefcases full of blood tests, financial statements, and psychological evaluations. The argument of the billionaire was brutally simple. He had the bloodline, and he had the money. He could provide the boys with private schools, trusts, funds, and elite medical care. Cora Washington was just a poor seamstress living in a house with a leaking roof. But Victor Sterling did not stop there. He wanted to completely destroy the reputation of Cora to ensure she could never contact the boys again. His lawyers called a surprise witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom opened, and Mayor Evelyn walked down the aisle. She took the oath and sat in the witness chair. She did not look at Cora. Evelyn lied under oath. She told the judge that Cora lived in utter squalor. She described the house as a dangerous trap full of exposed wiring and rotting wood. She brought up the night of the winter blizzard, twisting the story to make it sound like Cora had negligently forced a sick child out into the freezing snow for absolutely no reason. She claimed the boys were constantly fighting and causing trouble in the neighborhood, and that Cora was completely unfit to raise wild animals. Cora felt a hot tear roll down her cheek. She looked at the people of Pine Creek sitting in the gallery, watching the trial like it was an entertaining stage play. Not a single person stood up to defend her. Not a single person told the truth about the warm meals, the bedtime stories, and the total transformation of the 3 boys. The judge did not deliberate for long. The law in the state prioritized biological family above all else, especially when that family possessed immense wealth. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the desk. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Custody is hereby transferred entirely to the biological grandfather, Mr. Victor Sterling, the judge declared loudly. The boys are to be relocated to his primary residence immediately. Miss Washington, you are legally barred from contacting these minors until they reach the age of 18. It was over. Love had lost to money. The law did not care about who wiped the tears of a child or who stayed awake to break a fever. The law only cared about the signature on a bank account and the genetic markers in a blood test. The next morning, the black limousine returned to the dirt road. The sky was gray and heavy with unfallen rain. The summer air felt thick and suffocating. Cora stood on the front porch. 18 months ago, she had knelt on these very same wooden boards to welcome 3 broken strangers into her home. Now she was standing here to watch her entire world be ripped away. The boys brought their things out to the porch. They did not have suitcases. Despite the immense wealth of their grandfather, they were still using the same 3 black garbage bags they had arrived with. Julian came to her first. The 13-year-old boy who had learned to stop throwing punches and start building things completely fell apart. He wrapped his arms around the waist of Cora and buried his face into her stomach. He was sobbing so hard that his whole body shook violently. He bit down on his lower lip to stop the crying, biting so hard that a thin line of red blood trickled down his chin. "Do not let the anger win," baby Cora whispered, kissing the top of his head. Her own tears were falling freely now, soaking into his shirt. "Remember what I taught you under the oak tree. You control the fire. Do not ever let it burn you down." Julian nodded frantically, unable to speak. He stepped back, wiping his bloody lip with the back of his trembling hand. Then came Sam. The 10-year-old boy stood in front of her. He was no longer crying. His face was incredibly pale, but his eyes held a strange, ancient focus. He held out both of his hands. Resting in his palms was the battered leather notebook with the gold initials. It was the only thing he owned that connected him to his past. "Keep it for me," Sam said. His voice was completely steady, much stronger than the voice of a child should ever be. "I cannot take it with me. He will ruin it. Please keep it safe." Cora took the heavy leather notebook and pressed it tightly against her heart. "I promise, baby," she said, her voice cracking. "I will keep it right here until you come back." Finally, Leo stepped forward. The 16-year-old boy was nearly as tall as Cora now. He did not cry. His dark eyes were locked onto the sleek black limousine idling in the driveway, and they burned with a cold, terrifying intensity. The boy who had learned to smile over the past 18 months was gone. The wild defensive animal had returned, but this time the animal was incredibly smart. Leo looked at Cora. He reached out and held her rough, scarred hands. "We do not want to go," Leo whispered fiercely. "But if I fight them today, they will put you in jail. The lawyer told me outside the courtroom. They will arrest you if we do not get in that car." "I know," baby Cora sobbed, squeezing his hands. "You have to go. You have to survive this." Leo leaned in close, so close that the men standing near the limousine could not hear him. He looked directly into the deep brown eyes of the only real mother he had ever known. "Listen to me," Leo said, his voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. "This is not the end. We are going to go with him. We are going to learn everything he knows. We are going to take his power, and we are going to become stronger than him. And then we will come back for you." The horn of the limousine honked loudly, a rude and demanding sound that shattered the quiet morning. Victor Sterling rolled down the tinted window and shouted for the boys to hurry up. "I swear it on my life," Leo said, letting go of the hands of Cora. "We will come back to this house. Just wait for us." Leo turned around. He walked down the wooden steps, put his arm firmly around the shoulders of Julian, and guided his younger brothers toward the luxury car. The driver opened the heavy doors. One by one, the boys climbed inside. They did not look back. They knew that if they looked back, they would never be able to leave. The heavy doors slammed shut with a solid, expensive thud. The engine roared to life. The long black car rolled slowly down the dirt driveway, turned onto the main road, and drove away, kicking up a cloud of gray dust. Cora Washington stood entirely alone on her sagging front porch. The chaotic, wonderful noise of her family was completely gone. The overwhelming silence of the valley rushed back in, pressing against her ears and suffocating her lungs. She sank down into the old rocking chair, pulling the leather notebook tight against her chest, and she wept until there were absolutely no tears left in her body. The town of Pine Creek breathed a collective sigh of relief. The wealthy neighbors looked out their windows and smiled, glad that the troubled orphans were finally gone. Mayor Evelyn went to sleep that night, feeling completely vindicated. They all assumed the story was over. They assumed the boys would forget the poor seamstress and disappear into the glamorous world of the elite. But they were wrong. The story was not over. It was only taking a pause. Because miles away, sitting in the back of a silent luxury car, 3 young boys were making a silent pact. They were about to enter a golden cage, and they were prepared to spend the next 2 decades turning themselves into weapons. The Sterling estate was located in the wealthy and secluded hills of New England. It was not a house. It was a massive fortress built of cold gray stone, towering glass and black iron. When the limousine finally passed through the imposing security gates and came to a stop in front of the marble steps, the 3 boys felt like they were walking into a high-security prison. The air inside the mansion was perfectly climate-controlled, but it felt entirely devoid of warmth. There were no creaking floorboards. There were no smells of fresh tomato stew or warm bread. There was only the sterile scent of lemon polish and the terrifying echo of their own footsteps on the imported marble floors. Victor Sterling did not want grandsons. He wanted soldiers. He wanted perfect, obedient reflections of his own massive ego. On their very first night in the mansion, Victor ordered his staff to take the 3 black garbage bags that held the belongings of the boys and throw them directly into the incinerator. He replaced their worn-out clothes with custom-tailored uniforms and expensive suits. He erased every physical trace of their past life except for one thing. Sam had managed to hide his battered leather notebook inside the lining of his jacket, keeping the promise he made to his mother a secret from the billionaire. The first year inside the golden cage was sheer agony. The boys missed Cora with a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. They missed the soft hum of her sewing machine in the early mornings. They missed the way she would smooth down their hair before they went to sleep. Leo tried to write to her. Every single week, he would sit at his heavy mahogany desk and write a letter to the address in Pine Creek. He told her that they were okay, that they were studying hard, and that they had not forgotten her. But the letters never reached the small wooden house. Victor Sterling owned the local postmaster in his pocket. Every single letter was intercepted and brought directly to his massive private office. One cold evening in December, Victor summoned Leo, Julian, and Sam into his library. The walls were lined with thousands of books that nobody ever read. A massive fire roared in the stone fireplace. Victor stood by the flames holding a thick stack of envelopes. Leo immediately recognized his own handwriting. "Poverty is a highly contagious disease," Victor said coldly, looking down at the 3 boys. "It makes people weak. It makes people emotional. That woman in that pathetic dirt town is a symptom of that disease. You belong to the Sterling bloodline now. You will never speak her name again. And if you ever try to contact her again, I will personally ensure that the bank forecloses on her miserable little house and throws her into the street." Victor tossed the entire stack of letters directly into the roaring fire. The boys watched as the flames consumed the paper, turning their words of love into gray ash. Julian clenched his fists, ready to lunge at the old man, but Leo reached out and grabbed the shoulder of his younger brother, squeezing it with an iron grip. Leo looked deeply into the eyes of Julian and shook his head slightly. Leo understood in that exact moment that fighting physically would solve absolutely nothing. Crying would solve absolutely nothing. Victor Sterling held all the cards because he held all the power. If they wanted to protect Cora and if they ever wanted to see her again, they had to play the long game. They had to stop acting like frightened children and start acting like apex predators. Later that night, the 3 brothers gathered in the dark corner of the massive bedroom of Leo. They sat in a circle on the expensive carpet. "We do not fight him anymore," Leo whispered to his brothers, his eyes burning with a terrifying new clarity. "We do exactly what he wants. We become the perfect students. We learn every single thing about his business, his friends, and his enemies. We take his money, and we use it to build our own armor. We become so powerful that nobody will ever be able to tell us what to do again." Julian and Sam nodded in the darkness. On that night, the wild, broken orphans from Pine Creek officially died. In their place, 3 incredibly focused and dangerous young men were born. The metamorphosis over the next decade was absolute. They threw themselves into their education with a relentless, terrifying obsession. They did not attend parties. They did not make friends. They existed solely to consume knowledge and acquire power. Leo was groomed as the primary heir to the Sterling Empire. He attended an Ivy League university and earned dual degrees in finance and corporate management. He learned how to read a room, how to negotiate billion-dollar mergers, and how to completely ruin a rival company without leaving a single fingerprint. He learned to mask his emotions perfectly. During the day, he was the cold, calculating protege of Victor Sterling. But beneath that flawless corporate mask, Leo was constantly calculating the exact moment he would burn the empire of his grandfather to the ground. Julian channeled all of his aggressive energy into the courtroom. He realized that the law had been used as a weapon to tear his family apart, so he decided to become the master of that weapon. He went to the most prestigious law school in the country. He became a shark. He learned every single legal loophole, every corporate defense strategy, and every method of asset protection. He became the kind of lawyer who could paralyze an entire corporation with a single lawsuit. He wore expensive suits and smiled politely, but inside he was still the boy throwing heavy punches under the oak tree, only now his punches could bankrupt entire cities. Sam, the quiet boy who used to hide behind his brothers, became the silent architect of their absolute freedom. He possessed a genius-level intellect for mathematics and computer science. While other boys his age were playing video games, Sam was writing complex trading algorithms in the glowing blue light of his multiple computer screens. He understood how digital money moved across the globe. He understood how to hide assets in encrypted offshore accounts. He was the invisible ghost in the machine. Victor Sterling looked at his grandsons and felt incredibly proud. He believed his harsh methods had worked perfectly. He believed he had successfully broken their spirits and rebuilt them in his own cold image. He had absolutely no idea that he had simply invited 3 highly trained assassins into his own castle. When Leo turned 24, the brothers put their master plan into motion. They pooled together the massive trust funds and the monthly allowances Victor had given them. They met in absolute secret, using encrypted communication channels built by Sam. They created a shadow investment firm. It had no physical office. It existed entirely in the digital world through a complex web of anonymous shell companies designed by Julian. They named the firm CW Holdings. It stood for Cora Washington. Leo directed the massive investments. He used his inside knowledge of the corporate world to predict market shifts with terrifying accuracy. Sam deployed his custom algorithms to execute high-frequency trades that brought in massive profits entirely under the radar. Julian ensured that every single transaction was legally bulletproof and entirely untraceable back to the Sterling estate. For the next several years, the brothers lived a double life. By day, they sat in the sleek glass boardrooms of Victor Sterling, listening to the old man give orders and managing his real estate portfolio. But by night, they were the anonymous directors of CW Holdings, a ghost entity that was rapidly becoming one of the most profitable private funds on the eastern seaboard. Their wealth multiplied exponentially. They bought up large portions of technology companies, commercial real estate, and private banking institutions. They were quietly and systematically buying the very foundations of the world around them. The years marched on. The boys became men. The pain of being separated from Cora never faded. It only hardened into a sharp diamond-like resolve. They monitored her from a distance. They hired elite private investigators to watch over Pine Creek, ensuring that she was physically safe, but they knew they could not make direct contact yet. The lawyers of Victor were always watching, and the threat against her home was still active as long as the old man drew breath. They had to be patient. They had to wait for the golden cage to rust. By the year 2020, the balance of power finally shifted. Victor Sterling was in his late 80s. His health was failing rapidly. His mind was no longer as sharp as a razor, and his grip on his empire was beginning to slip. Meanwhile, Leo, Julian, and Sam were in their early 30s. They were in the absolute prime of their lives. And more importantly, CW Holdings had quietly surpassed the entire net worth of the Sterling estate. The 3 orphans who had arrived with their belongings in garbage bags were now billionaires in their own right, completely independent of the money of their grandfather. The cage was finally broken. The weapons were fully forged. The boys had become titans. And the long, dark winter of their separation was finally coming to an end. They were ready to go home. While the 3 boys were silently conquering the towering skyscrapers of the East Coast, time was moving much differently in the quiet valley of Pine Creek. For Leo, Julian, and Sam, the 20 years felt like a relentless and calculated march toward freedom. But for Cora Washington, those same 20 years felt like one long, agonizing winter that simply refused to end. The first few years after the black limousine took her boys away were the hardest. The house felt like a tomb. The silence was so loud it made her ears ring. Every single morning, Cora would wake up and walk past the empty bedrooms. She would look at the faded drawing Sam had made on the refrigerator, the one that said, "My family," and she would let the tears fall into her morning tea. She never stopped trying to reach them. Every Sunday evening, she sat at her small kitchen table and wrote 3 letters. She wrote about the blooming tomatoes in the garden. She wrote about the changing seasons in the valley. Most importantly, she wrote that she loved them and that she was still waiting for them to come back. She mailed the letters to the massive estate in New England using the address she had seen on the court documents. And every single week, the letters came back. They arrived with bold red ink stamped across the envelopes. Return to sender, addressee unknown. Cora refused to give up. She took the small amount of money she had saved for a new sewing machine and hired a cheap private investigator from a neighboring county. 2 weeks later, the investigator called her with a heavy sigh. He told her that Victor Sterling had completely erased the boys from the public record. They were hidden behind layers of corporate security and private boarding schools. The investigator told her to stop looking before the billionaire decided to crush her for good. So Cora had to love them from a distance. She prayed for them every night under the old wooden sign above her fireplace. But the town of Pine Creek did not leave her in peace. Mayor Evelyn had always despised Cora, and the custody trial gave Evelyn the perfect excuse to finally push the poor seamstress out of town. Evelyn spread the word among the wealthy wives of the valley. Within a month, nobody brought their dresses to Cora anymore. Her primary source of income completely vanished. To keep her house, Cora had to take whatever work she could find. She scrubbed the floors of the local diner late at night. She washed and ironed heavy hotel bedsheets by hand. Her fingers became permanently stained and crooked from the arthritis. Her shoulders stooped under the heavy weight of the physical labor. But she kept paying the mortgage dollar by dollar, determined to keep the house standing for the day her boys finally returned. Then came the year 2015. The universe decided to test the limits of what one woman could endure. Cora found a hard lump in her chest. The county doctor confirmed her worst fear. It was an aggressive form of breast cancer. She needed immediate surgery and months of grueling chemotherapy, but Cora had no health insurance and absolutely zero savings. She was entirely alone. There were no sons to hold her hand in the hospital waiting room. There was no family to cook her warm meals when the radiation made her too sick to stand. She had to fight the terrifying battle entirely by herself. To pay for the medical treatments, Cora had to sacrifice everything. She sold her beautiful antique sewing machine. She sold the wooden rocking chair from her front porch. When that was not enough, she went to the local bank and took out a massive second mortgage on her house. The treatments were pure agony. She lost all of her hair. She lost 30 pounds from her already frail frame. There were nights when she lay on the cold bathroom floor, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if it would be easier to just close her eyes and let the pain finally stop. But every time she wanted to give up, she thought of Leo, Julian, and Sam. She remembered the promise Leo had made on the porch. "We will come back to this house. Just wait for us." Cora survived the cancer. The doctors called it a miracle, but the financial toll was absolute devastation. The massive medical debt was added to the mortgage of her house. She was now a woman in her 60s, weakened by disease, carrying a financial burden she could never hope to pay off. The years continued to grind her down. The world outside the valley went through pandemics and massive changes, but Pine Creek remained the same cruel town. By the year 2023, Mayor Evelyn had grown even more powerful. She had a grand vision for the town. She wanted to bulldoze the old poor neighborhoods at the edge of the woods and build a massive luxury golf resort for wealthy tourists. There was only one problem. The decaying wooden house of Cora Washington was sitting right in the middle of the proposed development zone. Evelyn did not bother to make a fair offer for the land. She knew Cora was drowning in debt. She simply called a meeting with the director of the local bank, a man who owed his entire career to the political influence of the mayor. They looked at the file of Cora. They saw that she was struggling to make the monthly payments on her massive medical loans. They decided to squeeze her until she broke. The bank raised the interest rates on her loans. They demanded immediate payments that Cora could not possibly afford. Cora worked until her hands bled selling homemade bread on the side of the road, but it was never enough. The numbers were entirely rigged against her. In the cold winter of 2023, the official letters from the bank stopped arriving. Instead, they sent a final notice. It was a bright yellow piece of paper taped aggressively to her front door. Notice of foreclosure. Cora was 3 months behind on her payments. The total amount owed to stop the foreclosure was merely $2,400. For a wealthy person, it was nothing. But for Cora, it might as well have been $2 million. The notice stated clearly that she had exactly 90 days to pay the debt in full. If she failed, the bank would seize the property, evict her, and sell the land directly to the development company of Mayor Evelyn. Cora sat at her empty kitchen table staring at the yellow paper. The house was freezing. The blue tarp on the roof was still leaking, catching the winter rain in 3 plastic buckets. She had exactly $14 in her bank account. She was 65 years old. She was exhausted. She had fought the town, she had fought the billionaire, and she had fought the cancer. But looking at that final notice, Cora felt the last spark of hope inside her chest finally flicker and die. She realized she was going to lose the house. She was going to lose the only place her boys knew how to find her. She stood up slowly. Her joints popped and ached with the cold. She walked over to the brick fireplace. Resting safely on the wooden mantel, wrapped in a clean white cloth, was the leather notebook of Sam. It was the only thing in the house that had real value, not because of the leather, but because of the boy who had left it behind. Cora took the notebook and held it against her face. She closed her eyes. "Lord," she whispered into the empty room, "I am so tired. I do not know what to do anymore. I have absolutely nothing left to give." She traced the faded gold initials on the cover of the notebook. "If I have to leave this house, please let them know I kept my promise. Please let them know I kept it safe. Let them know I love them every single day." The spring of 2024 arrived. The 90 days were officially over. The bank finalized the paperwork. The eviction date was set for a bright Friday morning in April. Mayor Evelyn had already hired the bulldozers to wait at the edge of town. They were ready to tear the wooden house down the very second Cora was dragged off the property. Cora did not pack her things. She had nothing left to pack. She simply put on her faded floral dress, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and sat in her kitchen holding the leather notebook. She was waiting for the sheriff to arrive and force her out into the street. She had absolutely no idea that at that exact moment, 3 massive helicopters were already cutting through the clouds above the valley. She had no idea that the 3 little boys she had saved from the ice storm were now the most powerful men on the continent, and they were racing toward Pine Creek with a furious, unstoppable vengeance. The longest winter was finally over. The reckoning had arrived. Victor Sterling died quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday night in early March. He passed away in his massive, empty mansion, surrounded by expensive medical equipment and highly paid nurses, but entirely devoid of love. The reading of the will took place 2 days later. The lawyers formally transferred the entire Sterling empire worth billions of dollars directly to Leo, Julian, and Sam. The 3 brothers sat in the sterile conference room and signed the final documents. They did not shed a single tear for the old man. As soon as the ink was dry on the paper, Leo stood up and looked at his brothers. "The waiting is over," Leo said firmly. "We are finding her today." But locating Cora Washington after 20 years was not a simple task. Victor Sterling had deliberately destroyed all of her previous contact information. The brothers had the name of the town, but Pine Creek was a rural valley that operated largely off the digital grid. Sam immediately deployed a private team of elite investigators and corporate fixers. He sat behind his glowing computer monitors, hacking into the obscure county property databases of the valley, searching for any record connected to the name Cora Washington. For 3 agonizing days, they found absolutely nothing. Then, late on a Thursday night, an alarm went off on the computer screen of Sam. He had finally breached the secure servers of the local Pine Creek Bank. He opened a digitized file, and his blood ran entirely cold. "Leo, Julian, get in here right now," Sam shouted. His voice echoed through the massive penthouse apartment they shared. The 2 older brothers rushed into the room. Sam pointed to the bright screen. It was a digital copy of the yellow foreclosure notice. "The bank is seizing the house," Sam said, his fingers flying across the keyboard to read the fine print. The medical debts from her cancer treatments compounded. She missed 3 payments. The total amount owed is a few $1,000s, but the local bank accelerated the foreclosure process illegally. "Who ordered the acceleration?" Julian asked. His eyes narrowed as the brilliant legal mind inside his head began to analyze the crime. Sam pulled up a string of emails connected to the bank manager. "It was ordered by Mayor Evelyn," Sam replied. "She is using a dummy corporation to buy the land for a golf resort. She is evicting Mom tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. They are going to bulldoze the house with all of her belongings inside." Leo looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was already past 2 in the morning. Pine Creek was a 6-hour drive away through winding mountain roads. If they drove the luxury cars, they would never make it in time. The bulldozers would destroy the only home they had ever known, and the shock could easily kill the fragile woman who had saved their lives. "Call the aviation team," Leo ordered, his voice transforming into the cold, commanding tone of a billionaire CEO. "Get the corporate helicopter fueled and ready on the roof. We are taking the air route. Julian, call our legal division. Tell them to draft an emergency purchase order for the entire Pine Creek Bank. We are not just paying off her mortgage. We are buying the bank that dared to threaten her." As the sun began to rise over the East Coast, the three brothers stepped into a sleek black helicopter. They were no longer the helpless, crying orphans who had been dragged away in a limousine. They were a terrifying force of nature, and they were bringing a financial storm directly to the valley. Back in Pine Creek, the morning sun was bright and incredibly cruel. Mayor Evelyn stood on the dirt road in front of the small wooden house. She was wearing a pristine white coat, looking remarkably cheerful for a woman who was about to throw an elderly citizen into the street. Beside her stood the county sheriff, looking slightly uncomfortable, and a massive yellow bulldozer idling loudly. A large crowd of townspeople had gathered at the edge of the property. Word had spread quickly that the poor seamstress was finally being kicked out. Some people felt a brief twinge of guilt, remembering the beautiful dresses Cora used to sew for their daughters, but nobody stepped forward to stop the eviction. They just stood there watching the tragedy unfold like a free morning show. The sheriff walked up the sagging wooden steps and knocked loudly on the peeling front door. "Miss Washington," the sheriff called out over the rumbling noise of the bulldozer. "The legal grace period is officially over. The property now belongs to the Town Development Committee. You have to vacate the premises immediately. If you do not step outside, I will have to physically remove you." The crowd fell completely silent. Mayor Evelyn checked her expensive gold watch and let out an annoyed sigh. Slowly, the front door creaked open. Cora stepped out onto the porch. She looked incredibly fragile. Her hair was entirely white, and her body was thin and weathered from the years of hard labor and sickness. But despite her physical weakness, she stood perfectly straight. She held her head high. She did not carry any suitcases or boxes. The only thing she held was the battered leather notebook pressed tightly against her chest with both of her scarred hands. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at the crowd. She looked directly at Mayor Evelyn. "You won," Evelyn, Cora said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the crisp morning air. "You took my home. You took my health. You took everything I ever owned. But you will never take what happened inside these walls. You will never know what it feels like to truly love someone other than yourself." Evelyn rolled her eyes, completely unmoved by the emotional speech. "Save the drama for the homeless shelter, Cora," the mayor said sharply. "Sheriff, escort her off the property. Driver, start the demolition." The operator inside the massive yellow bulldozer pulled a heavy metal lever. The machine let out a deafening roar and lurched forward, its huge metal blade lowering toward the fragile wooden porch. Cora closed her eyes and gripped the notebook tighter, waiting for the impact. But the impact never came. Instead, a different sound pierced the air. It was a low, heavy rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of every house on the street. The ground began to shake. The townspeople turned their heads toward the main road in total confusion. The rhythmic chopping roar of helicopter blades echoed off the surrounding mountains, growing louder and more intense by the second. A massive shadow swept over the crowd as a sleek corporate helicopter banked sharply above the trees. And then the convoy appeared. 3 matte black SUVs, flanked by 2 private security vehicles, turned off the main highway and roared down the dirt road. They did not slow down for the potholes. They moved with absolute terrifying authority. The lead vehicle swerved sharply and parked its massive armored body directly between the yellow bulldozer and the wooden porch, completely blocking the path of the machine. The bulldozer operator slammed on his brakes, his eyes wide with panic. The crowd gasped and stepped back. Mayor Evelyn dropped her clipboard into the dirt, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. "Who do you think you are?" Evelyn shouted, stepping forward angrily. "This is a private town matter. Move those vehicles right now or I will have you all arrested." The engine of the lead SUV cut off. The heavy armored door swung open. Leo stepped out into the morning light. He was 34 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating absolute power. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His face was hard and unreadable, just like the man who had raised him, but his eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire. Julian stepped out of the second vehicle. He moved with the confident grace of a man who commanded courtrooms for a living. And finally, Sam emerged from the third vehicle, adjusting his glasses, his face completely calm but his mind calculating every single detail of the scene. The townspeople froze. The older residents of Pine Creek looked at the specific facial features of the 3 billionaires. They looked at the blue-green eyes of Sam. They looked at the jawline of Leo. A sudden terrifying wave of realization washed over the crowd. They recognized the 3 wild orphans they had thrown away 20 years ago. Leo completely ignored the angry mayor. He ignored the county sheriff who was nervously backing away. He ignored the massive yellow bulldozer idling just inches from his expensive car. He turned his back to the entire town and walked straight toward the wooden porch. As Leo looked up at the fragile, white-haired woman standing on the steps, the cold corporate mask he had worn for 20 years completely shattered. The billionaire CEO vanished, and the 14-year-old boy, who had been saved from a winter storm, finally returned. "Mom," Leo whispered, his voice cracked with the weight of 2 decades of suppressed grief. Cora stared at the tall, powerful man standing in her dirt yard. She looked at his eyes. She looked past the expensive suit and saw the soul of the angry boy who used to eat her warm stew in silence. Cora gasped. The leather notebook slipped from her hands. It hit the wooden floorboards with a soft thud. Her legs instantly gave out. She fell forward, weeping uncontrollably, entirely overcome by a joy so massive it felt like her heart was going to burst. Leo ran up the wooden steps. He caught her right before she hit the ground. He wrapped his strong arms around her frail body, burying his face in her shoulder, holding her so tightly it seemed he was trying to merge their souls back together. Julian and Sam rushed up the steps right behind him. They fell to their knees on the old porch, wrapping their arms around their mother and their older brother. 4 people knelt on the decaying wooden boards, crying openly, completely ignoring the entire world around them. The 20 years of agonizing separation, the years of pain, the years of silence, and the years of building a massive empire were finally over. The boys had kept their promise. They had come back to the house, and they were about to show the town of Pine Creek exactly what happens when you try to destroy the mother of 3 billionaires. Part 9. The Judgment of Pine Creek and the Reign of Justice. For a long time, the only sound on the dirt road was the quiet weeping of a mother and her 3 sons. The massive yellow bulldozer remained completely silent. The angry townspeople did not say a single word. They were entirely paralyzed by the unbelievable scene unfolding on the decaying wooden porch. Cora pulled back slightly. Her trembling hands reached up to touch the face of Leo, then Julian, and finally Sam. She traced the lines of their jaws. She looked into their eyes, searching for the broken, terrified boys she had saved 20 years ago. The fear was completely gone. In its place was an incredible strength. They were grown men. They were powerful. And, most importantly, they were finally home. "You came back," Cora whispered, her voice barely audible over the idling engines of the black vehicles. "You really came back to me." "We promised, Mom," Leo said softly, wiping a tear from his own cheek. "We told you we would come back when we were strong enough to protect you. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again." Sam reached down and picked up his old, battered leather notebook from the wooden floorboards. He held it tightly, smiling at Cora with the exact same gentle smile he had when he was an 8-year-old boy. "You kept it safe," Sam said. "Thank you for keeping it safe." The beautiful private moment was suddenly shattered by a loud, obnoxious cough. Mayor Evelyn had recovered from her initial shock. Her face was turning a deep shade of red, fueled by a mixture of deep embarrassment and rising anger. She did not care if these men were billionaires. She was the mayor of Pine Creek, and this was her town. She stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at the porch. "This is a very touching reunion," Evelyn shouted loudly, attempting to regain control of the crowd. "But it does not change the law. This property has been legally foreclosed. The deadline passed at 9 o'clock this morning. I do not care who you are or how much money you have. You are trespassing on municipal property. Sheriff, do your job and remove these people right now." The county sheriff took a hesitant step forward, his hand resting nervously on his utility belt. But before he could speak, the atmosphere around the porch completely changed. Leo stood up. He slowly turned his back to his mother and faced the crowd. The warm, emotional sun vanished instantly. The ruthless, terrifying billionaire who commanded global industries stepped into the light. He walked down the wooden steps, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an apex predator. Julian followed right behind him, carrying his sleek leather briefcase. Sam remained on the porch, wrapping a protective arm around the shoulders of Cora. Leo stopped just a few feet away from Mayor Evelyn. He looked down at her. His eyes were so cold and so completely devoid of mercy that Evelyn involuntarily took a step backward. "You like to talk about the law, Mayor," Evelyn Leo said. His voice was smooth, but it carried a heavy, dangerous weight that echoed across the quiet dirt road. "You like to use the law to crush people who cannot fight back. You used it 20 years ago to help a billionaire steal us away from the only mother we ever had. And today, you tried to use it to throw an old sick woman into the street so you could build a golf course. Evelyn swallowed hard, her confidence beginning to crack. That is completely absurd, she stammered. This is a standard bank foreclosure. It has absolutely nothing to do with me personally. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. He stepped forward and placed his leather briefcase on the hood of the black SUV. He snapped the metal latches open. We know exactly who you are, Evelyn. Julian said, his voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence. We have spent the last 12 hours analyzing every single financial transaction in this valley. We know about the dummy corporation registered under the maiden name of your sister. We know you pressured the local bank director to illegally accelerate the foreclosure process on the medical debt of our mother. Julian pulled a thick stack of documents from the briefcase and held them up for the entire crowd to see. At 4 o'clock this morning, Julian continued, his voice rising. My legal team contacted the regional board of the Pine Creek Valley Bank. They were very happy to hear from us. In fact, they were so happy that CW Holdings officially purchased the entire bank an hour ago. We own it. We own every single asset, every single loan, and every single mortgage in this town. The crowd let out a collective, terrified gasp. The people of Pine Creek suddenly realized that the three orphans they had despised now held the financial fate of the entire valley in the palms of their hands. Julian pulled a bright yellow piece of paper from the stack. It was the original foreclosure notice. He looked right into the eyes of Evelyn and ripped the paper entirely in half. He dropped the pieces into the dirt. The debt of Cora Washington is paid in full, Julian declared. This house belongs to her forever, and the land you are planning to build your luxury resort on now belongs entirely to us. Evelyn was hyperventilating. Her political career, her hidden wealth, and her grand plans were evaporating right before her eyes. You cannot do this, she shrieked, her voice pitching into absolute panic. This is illegal. I will sue you. I will have the federal authorities investigate your company. Please do, Leo said calmly, leaning in closer to the panicked mayor. Because my brother Sam already sent your financial records to the federal investigators. They are highly interested in the municipal funds you embezzled over the last 6 years to fund your dummy corporations. In fact, if you listen closely, you can probably hear the sirens right now. Evelyn turned completely pale. She looked at the county sheriff, silently begging for help. The sheriff slowly took his hand off his utility belt and took 3 large steps away from her, completely severing his ties with the corrupt politician. Leo turned his gaze away from the ruined mayor. He looked out at the massive crowd of townspeople. The people who had gossiped in the grocery store aisles. The people who had turned their backs when Cora was fighting cancer alone. The people who had gathered this morning to watch her lose everything. 20 years ago, Leo said, his voice echoing across the silent valley, a winter storm hit this town. The power went out. My little brother was freezing to death. Our mother walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow, knocking on your doors, begging for a ride to the clinic. And every single one of you locked your doors. You let her walk alone. Many people in the crowd lowered their heads in deep, crushing shame. When the billionaire came to take us away, Leo continued, the anger finally bleeding into his words. You stood in the courthouse and you lied under oath. You called our mother a thief. You called her unfit. And when we were gone, you made sure she lost her livelihood. You watched her sell her furniture to pay for her cancer treatments. You watched her starve, and you did absolutely nothing. The silence was so heavy, it felt like the air itself had turned to lead. If it were up to me, Leo said, his jaw clenching tightly, I would use the bank we just bought to call in every single loan in this valley. I would foreclose on your businesses. I would take your homes. I would let you feel the exact same terror my mother felt this morning. I would burn this entire town to the ground and turn it into a parking lot. A woman in the front row of the crowd began to cry quietly, terrified for her family and her home. They all knew the billionaire standing before them had the absolute power to ruin their lives with a single phone call. But then the quiet voice of Sam drifted down from the wooden porch. But we are not going to do that, Sam said. Leo stopped speaking. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the heavy anger slowly drain out of his chest. He nodded to his younger brother. Sam walked down the wooden steps and stood beside Leo. He looked at the frightened faces of the townspeople. When I was 8 years old, Sam said softly, I stopped speaking because I believed the world was completely evil. I believed that people only cared about themselves. But the woman standing on that porch taught me that I was wrong. She taught us that family is not about blood. She taught us that true strength does not come from destroying your enemies. True strength comes from the courage to heal them. Sam looked at Mayor Evelyn, who was now weeping in the dirt, completely broken. "We are not like you, Evelyn," Sam said. "We do not destroy people just because we have the power to do it." Julian stepped forward. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another stack of documents. Effective immediately, Julian announced, CW Holdings is forgiving all outstanding medical debt held by the Pine Creek Valley Bank. Every single medical loan in this town is hereby canceled. Furthermore, we are establishing a $50 million foundation in the name of Cora Washington. This foundation will provide free legal representation for any foster family in the state, ensuring that no child is ever torn away from a loving home simply because they lack the money to fight. The crowd was completely stunned. They had braced themselves for complete financial ruin. They had expected the brutal revenge they absolutely deserved. Instead, they were being handed massive, life-changing forgiveness. It was a level of grace that was completely incomprehensible to them. A man in the back of the crowd slowly started to clap. Then a woman joined him. Within seconds, the entire crowd of townspeople broke into massive, overwhelming applause. People were crying, hugging each other, and shouting words of deep gratitude toward the wooden porch. The guilt and the shame of 20 years were being washed away by the sheer mercy of the family they had once tried to destroy. Leo turned around. He walked back up the wooden steps and stood in front of Cora. She was looking at him with eyes full of absolute wonder and endless pride. "Did we do it right, Mom?" Leo asked softly, a gentle smile finally breaking across his face. "Did we control the fire?" Cora reached out and pulled the tall, powerful billionaire into her arms. She hugged him tightly, resting her white head against his expensive suit. "You did perfectly, my beautiful boy," Cora whispered, her tears soaking into his jacket. "You did perfectly. Now please tell those big cars to move out of my yard. I have to go inside and make some dinner because my boys are finally home and nobody in this house goes to sleep without knowing they are loved." 1 year later, the valley of Pine Creek was completely unrecognizable. The suffocating atmosphere of judgment and quiet exclusion had entirely vanished. It had been washed away by a massive wave of absolute forgiveness. Mayor Evelyn had resigned in utter disgrace just 2 days after the incident on the dirt road. Facing multiple federal investigations as into her dummy corporations and embezzled municipal funds, she packed her expensive bags and left the town in the dead of night, never to be seen again. The corrupt local bank manager had been swiftly fired. CW Holdings transformed the predatory bank into a community credit union that offered zero-interest loans to families struggling to pay for groceries and medical bills. But the most incredible transformation happened on the massive plot of land at the edge of the woods. The area where Evelyn had planned to build her exclusive luxury golf resort was now a sprawling, beautiful campus. It was called the Cora Washington Family Resource Center. It featured 3 stories of modern architecture with bright, towering glass windows and safe, vibrant playgrounds. It was the nicest facility for 50 miles in any direction. It provided emergency housing, top-tier psychological counseling, and free educational tutoring for hundreds of displaced children across the state. But the most striking detail of the massive campus was located right in the very center. The brilliant architects had wanted to tear down the old decaying wooden house to make room for a larger parking lot. Leo firmly refused. Instead, he ordered his construction teams to reinforce the foundation of the old house. They fixed the leaking roof, replacing the infamous blue tarp with solid weatherproof shingles. They repaired the creaking floorboards and gave the exterior a fresh coat of warm, inviting paint. They kept the small house exactly where it was. It stood proudly in the center of the modern campus, completely surrounded by a beautiful blooming garden of fresh tomatoes and bright flowers. It was a permanent monument to the town. It was a daily reminder that the most powerful empire in the valley did not start in a corporate boardroom. It started in a leaking kitchen with 3 plastic buckets and a woman who refused to give up. The brothers stayed incredibly close to their mother. They realized that chasing endless corporate profits was meaningless compared to the family they had almost lost. Leo completely relocated the primary headquarters of his massive investment firm to Pine Creek. He ran the $50 million foundation full-time. He personally reviewed every single grant application, ensuring that no child ever slipped through the cracks of the system the way he almost had. Julian built the largest free legal clinic in the state right on the first floor of the Resource Center. He provided elite legal representation for parents fighting to keep their children out of the system. He was currently pushing a massive, groundbreaking bill through the state legislature. It was called the Cora Washington Family Preservation Act, and it was designed to make it entirely illegal for the state to separate siblings in foster care. The boy who used to solve his problems with his fists was now protecting thousands of families with his brilliant mind. Sam opened a technology and education wing on the second floor. He offered free coding classes and computer science scholarships to teenagers who had aged out of the foster system, giving them the exact same tools he had used to build his own freedom. He also designed a highly encrypted revolutionary database that matched orphan children with thoroughly vetted, loving families in record time. The pain of the past was finally turning into the ultimate healing for the future. It was a warm, golden Sunday afternoon in the late spring. The front porch of the old wooden house was incredibly crowded. The quiet, empty days were gone forever. The yard was filled with loud laughter, the smell of barbecue, and the sound of pure joy. Leo was standing by a massive metal grill, wearing an expensive silk shirt covered in barbecue sauce, laughing loudly as Julian tried to steal a piece of chicken with a pair of metal tongs. Sam was sitting on the wooden porch steps holding a beautiful 2-year-old baby girl in his arms. Her name was Little Cora. She had the exact same bright, curious eyes as her father. Cora sat at the center of it all. She was resting comfortably in a sturdy, beautifully carved new rocking chair that Julian had built for her with his own hands. Her hair was completely white, and the wrinkles on her face were deep, but she looked 10 years younger than she had on the day of the eviction. The heavy, crushing burden of sheer survival was completely gone. She was wearing a beautiful, soft cotton dress that she did not have to sew herself. She looked out at her real family. She looked at the 3 powerful, brilliant men she had raised from broken, terrified orphans. Her heart was so completely full that she thought it might physically burst. Suddenly, inside the house, the heavy rotary phone on the kitchen wall began to ring. It was the exact same loud, jarring ring from 20 years ago. The sound cut through the laughter in the yard. Cora slowly stood up from her rocking chair. She walked inside the house, leaving the bright sunshine behind, and picked up the heavy receiver. "Hello," Cora answered softly. "Cora, it is Brenda," the voice on the other end said. The social worker was long retired, but she still volunteered at the county center making emergency calls. "I know you are incredibly busy these days. I know your house is full. But there is a little girl at the station. She is 7 years old. She has absolutely nobody left in the world, and none of the emergency homes have an open bed tonight." Cora did not say a word. She held the phone and looked out the kitchen window. She watched her 3 billionaire sons playing in the yard. She watched Sam gently bouncing little Cora on his knee. She looked at the wooden sign hanging above her brick fireplace. A house only becomes a home when it is brave enough to hold someone else's pain. Her house was full, but her heart was absolutely endless. "Bring her to me, Brenda," Cora said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Bring her home." Exactly 1 hour later, a state county vehicle pulled up to the edge of the blooming garden. The back door opened. A little girl stepped out onto the grass. She was incredibly small, holding a torn plastic grocery bag containing everything she owned. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. She looked at the massive modern buildings, and then she looked at the old wooden house. Cora walked down the wooden porch steps. She did not look back at her 3 sons who had completely stopped what they were doing and were now standing silently behind her, forming an absolute, unbreakable wall of protection. Cora knelt right there in the soft green grass, bringing herself down to the exact eye level of the terrified little girl. She reached out with her scarred, gentle hands. "Hello, sweetheart," Cora said softly. "My name is Mama Cora. This house is old and it is not very big, but as long as you are standing under this roof, you are completely safe." The little girl looked into the deep, warm brown eyes of the old woman. For the first time in a very long time, the child let out a shaky breath, stepped forward, and took the hand of Cora. Some things never change, and some things should never change. So that is the unbelievable story of Cora Washington. She was a woman who said yes when the entire world told her to say no. She was a woman who walked through a deadly ice storm with frozen feet, who fought a ruthless billionaire in a courtroom, and who waited 20 agonizing years in absolute silence. She was a mother who proved that one single act of pure kindness has the power to change the entire world. 20 years is an incredibly long time to wait for justice. Cora lost her only source of income. She beat an aggressive cancer entirely alone. She almost lost the only home she ever knew, and she never once stopped praying for those 3 boys. Everybody in that town had a logical reason not to help. It was too risky. It was too complicated. It was simply not their problem. But Cora, making a few $100s a month with buckets catching the rain on her kitchen floor, said to bring them here. She offered no conditions and absolutely no hesitation, and the world punished her deeply for it. The corrupt court took her boys away. The town called her terrible names. The cancer nearly destroyed her physical body. But absolutely nothing could touch the pure love she had planted inside the hearts of those 3 children. Because 20 years later, 3 men worth billions of dollars did not return to the valley to build a massive mansion for themselves. They did not buy giant yachts or private islands. They bought an entire town just to protect her, and they built a massive foundation in her name. That is not just money talking. That is pure love coming home. And that is the ultimate truth about the universe. True kindness does not always pay off on your preferred timeline. Sometimes you have to suffer. Sometimes it takes 20 years of absolute silence. But true love always comes back. Has someone ever showed up for you when absolutely nobody else would? Has someone ever walked through an ice storm to save you? Tell me about them in the comments below. They truly deserve to be named and recognized. If this story touched your heart today, if you needed a reminder that quiet, unshakable goodness still exists in this dark world, please do me a massive favor. Hit that like button right now. It helps this channel more than you will ever know. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who is struggling, someone who feels invisible, or someone who has completely given up hope. And if you have not already done so, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We have so many more incredible stories coming. We tell the stories of ordinary people doing absolutely extraordinary things. We tell this story every single week. Remember, family does not require a perfect bloodline. It just requires someone who is willing to stay when the storm gets completely dark. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. I will see you in the next one. The camera pulled back the warmth of the roaring fire, fading into the dark, snowy exterior of the mountain. Silas stood on the porch of the lodge one last time, the wind tugging at his coat, but his face was set in a peaceful, determined expression. He looked into the lens, his voice steady. "There is a final lesson in all of this," he said. "One I learned the hard way in the quiet of a cold lobby. We spend our lives building walls to keep out the things that make us feel uncomfortable or unimportant, or less than the image we have curated for ourselves. We call it brand standards. We call it exclusivity. We call it protection." He leaned in the firelight from behind him, casting a long shadow against the frosted wood of the lodge. "But every wall you build to keep someone out is a wall that keeps you from seeing the truth of what you have built. I built this place to be a sanctuary, yet for years I allowed it to become a fortress of vanity. It took losing my way to find my purpose again." He stood up, adjusting his collar, his silhouette framed against the vast, star-filled sky of the Rocky Mountains. If you are a leader, do not wait for the reviews to turn sour. Do not wait for your own house to rot before you step through the front door and see what your customers see, what your employees endure, and what your brand has actually become. If you don't know the names of the people who do the hardest work in your organization, you don't know your business at all. Silas turned toward the darkness of the mountain pass, the lodge door clicking shut behind him, cutting off the muffled sound of laughter and warmth. "I'll see you in the next one," he said. "And remember, keep your doors open and your fires burning. You never know who is walking in, and you never know what they might be worth." The screen faded to black. A single final text overlay appeared in crisp white letters. "Everyone deserves a seat." The video ended, leaving only the soft ambient sound of a crackling fire and the howling wind.